Welcome to 80s horror stories, where the past does not stay buried, and some things never stop watching. Tonight's story is not about a ghost. It is not about a demon. It is not about anything that announces itself with screams or shadows or slamming doors. Tonight's story is about something far worse. Something patient. Something that had been there long before anyone moved in. Something that had learned, over many years, how to be completely invisible. And the most terrifying part? It was not hiding because it was afraid. It was hiding because it was waiting. This is the story of the Mercer family. And the man who watched from the walls. The year was 1983. The town of Harlow Creek, Virginia was the kind of place that looked perfect in photographs. Wide streets lined with oak trees whose branches touched overhead like cathedral arches. White picket fences. Children riding bicycles in the afternoon light. Church bells on Sunday mornings. A diner on Main Street that smelled like coffee and warm pie. From the outside, Harlow Creek looked like safety itself. Like the kind of town nothing bad ever touched. But every town has a street the locals avoid after dark. In Harlow Creek, that street was Ashford Lane. And at the very end of Ashford Lane, set back from the road behind a row of overgrown hedges and two oak trees so old their roots had cracked the sidewalk clean in half, stood the Bellard House. Nobody called it the Bellard House anymore. Not out loud. Not since what happened to the Bellard family in 1971. But everyone in Harlow Creek knew which house it was. They knew it by the way the paint had gone gray while every other house on the street stayed white. They knew it by the windows that somehow always looked darker than they should, even on bright summer afternoons. They knew it by the silence around it, a silence that did not feel natural, that did not feel like the absence of sound, but like the presence of something holding its breath. The real estate listing described it as a 4-bedroom colonial with original hardwood floors, a finished basement, and significant historic charm. It did not mention the walls. It never mentioned the walls. Thomas Mercer was 34 years old when he moved his family to Harlow Creek. He was the kind of man who believed in practical solutions. If something was broken, you fixed it. If something was dark, you turned on a light. If someone told you a house had a bad history, you asked for the paperwork and checked the foundation yourself. He had grown up in Chicago, married his college sweetheart Helen at 26, and by 30 had 2 children, a daughter named Claire who was 9 and a son named Daniel who was 6. Thomas had taken a position managing a textile factory outside Harlow Creek, and when the company offered to cover relocation costs, he started looking at houses immediately. He found the listing for the house on Ashford Lane on a Tuesday. By Thursday he had scheduled a walk-through. By the following Monday he had signed the papers. He told Helen it was the best deal they would ever find. 4 bedrooms, good bones, and a price so low it seemed like a mistake. Helen had hesitations she could not fully explain. She told Thomas the house felt strange when they walked through it. Too quiet, she said. Like it was listening. Thomas smiled the way practical men smile when they think someone is being emotional and told her all old houses feel that way. They moved in on a Saturday in early September. The oak trees were just beginning to turn. The air smelled like autumn and cut grass and something else, something faintly metallic that Helen noticed but did not mention because she did not want Thomas to smile at her that way again. The first strange thing happened on their 3rd night in the house. Daniel woke up at 2 in the morning and walked to his parents' room. He was not crying. He was not scared, not exactly. He stood at the foot of their bed in his pajamas and said in a very calm voice that there was a man in his wall. Thomas got up, checked the room, checked the closet, checked under the bed. Nothing. He told Daniel it was a dream and tucked him back in and that was that. Except it was not that. Because the next night Daniel said it again. Same time. Same calm voice. There is a man in my wall. And the night after that. And the night after that. By the end of the first week Helen had moved Daniel into Claire's room. She told herself it was just transition anxiety. New house, new town, new school. Children imagine things. She believed that. She almost believed that. Claire was the first one to see something she could not explain away. It happened on a Wednesday afternoon, 2 weeks after they moved in. She was doing homework at the desk in her room, the one positioned against the wall that separated her room from the narrow space above the staircase. The house was quiet. Thomas was at work. Helen was downstairs. Daniel was playing in the backyard. Claire was writing a book report on Charlotte's Web when she became aware of a sound coming from inside the wall directly beside her. It was not a settling sound. It was not pipes. It was not the house breathing the way old houses breathe. It was slow and deliberate and rhythmic, like something pressing its weight against the inside of the wall and then slowly releasing, pressing and releasing, the way a person might lean against a surface to feel what was on the other side. Claire sat very still for a long moment. Then she picked up her pencil and tapped once on the wall. The sound stopped immediately. Complete silence. And then, after a pause so long she had almost convinced herself she had imagined everything, something tapped back. Once. Deliberate. Certain. Claire did not scream. She walked downstairs very calmly and told her mother she did not want to do homework in her room anymore. Helen asked why. Claire said she did not want to talk about it. She never did homework at that desk again. I need to tell you something about the history of that house before we go any further, because the history is the thing that makes everything else make sense, or rather, the thing that makes everything else make a terrible, specific, unavoidable kind of sense. The house had been built in 1887 by a man named Cornelius Vane. Vane was an architect by training but a recluse by nature. He had no family, no close friends, no social obligations he acknowledged. He designed the house himself and supervised its construction personally, which the local builders at the time found unusual. He was particular about the walls. Very particular. He insisted on wider wall cavities than were structurally necessary. He insisted on specific placements for interior access panels that the builders assumed were for plumbing or ventilation. He dismissed workers who asked too many questions. The house was finished in the spring of 1888 and Vane moved in alone and almost immediately became invisible to the town. He was seen occasionally, at the post office, at the hardware store, always alone, always moving quickly, always looking like a man with somewhere specific to be. His neighbors described him as polite but distant. His eyes, several of them mentioned independently, always seemed to be focused on something just behind whoever he was talking to. Cornelius Vane died in 1901. The official cause was listed as heart failure. He was found in the basement, sitting in a chair, facing the wall. The expression on his face, according to the man who found him, was not pain. It was not fear. It was something the man struggled to describe for the rest of his life. The closest he ever came was this: it looked like satisfaction. After Vane, the house passed through 4 families in 30 years. The Holloways stayed 11 months. The Prices stayed 7. The Garfield family lasted almost 2 years, which was longer than most, until their youngest son was found in the basement at 3 in the morning, standing against the wall with both palms pressed flat against the surface, eyes open, completely unresponsive. He did not remember how he got there. He did not remember anything after going to bed. The Garfields were gone within a week. Then came the Bellards in 1959. Raymond and Estelle Bellard and their 3 children. They lasted 12 years, which was by far the longest any family had stayed. And then in the winter of 1971 Raymond Bellard called the police from the kitchen telephone at 4 in the morning and told the dispatcher in a very quiet and very steady voice that there was someone living inside his walls. The responding officers found nothing. No signs of entry. No evidence of occupation. No footprints, no food, no belongings. Nothing that suggested any living person had been inside the wall cavities. Raymond Bellard was taken to the county psychiatric facility for evaluation. He was kept for 6 weeks. When he came home he refused to speak about what he had seen or heard. He sold the house within the month and moved his family to Richmond and never came back to Harlow Creek. Ever. Not once. The house sat empty for 12 years. Until the Mercers. Thomas Mercer was not a man who went looking for trouble. But trouble, in that house, had a way of finding you whether you went looking or not. It started with small things. Tools he had left on the workbench in the basement appearing in different positions in the morning. A smell in the upstairs hallway late at night, faint and specific, like unwashed clothing and something beneath that, something older and harder to name. Cold spots that moved. Not the fixed cold spots of a drafty house but cold that seemed to travel, that you would walk through and then turn around and it would be gone, replaced by warmth, as if something had been standing there and moved when you turned to look. He noticed marks on the inside of the hall closet. At first he thought they were damage from the previous owners. Scratches in the drywall at roughly shoulder height. But when he looked more closely he realized the scratches faced inward. They had been made from inside the wall. Helen Mercer was a practical woman in her own right, but she was also the kind of person who trusted what her body told her. And her body, from the first week in that house, told her something was wrong. She could not point to a single specific thing and say this is the problem. It was accumulative. The way the house felt different at night than it did during the day, not just darker but denser, more present, like something that had been holding itself apart during daylight hours let itself relax after dark. The way sound traveled strangely through the walls, conversations she was certain she had heard clearly muffled, but other sounds amplified, small sounds, sounds she could not identify, closer and more distinct than they should have been. The way she sometimes had the absolute certain feeling of being watched when she was alone in a room, not a vague unease but a specific directed attention, the feeling of eyes. She started leaving lights on at night. All of them. Thomas asked her about the electricity bill. She told him she just felt better with the lights on. He did not push it. He had started leaving a light on himself, though he had not mentioned it to her. The clearest and most undeniable thing happened 6 weeks after they moved in, on a night in mid-October when a storm had knocked the power out and the whole house was dark except for the candles Helen had placed in every room. Thomas was downstairs. Helen was putting the children to bed. Daniel had fallen asleep quickly but Claire was restless. Helen sat with her until she settled and then stood in the doorway for a moment looking at her children. And that was when she saw it. On the wall above Daniel's bed. In the faint candlelight, barely visible, but there. A slight depression in the wallpaper. Moving slowly, horizontal, like a finger tracing a line from the inside. Helen did not move. She stood in that doorway and watched that slow deliberate movement across the wall above her sleeping son and she felt something she had never felt before in her life and could not name precisely but that lived somewhere between terror and understanding. Because in that moment she knew with complete certainty that whatever was on the other side of that wall was aware of her. That it had been aware of her for weeks. That it had been watching, learning, measuring all of them, their routines, their schedules, their sleep patterns, the sounds they made and the sounds they responded to, and that it had been doing this with the patience of something that did not experience time the way she did. Something that had nowhere else to be. She backed away from the doorway slowly and went downstairs and told Thomas what she had seen. And for the first time since they had moved in, Thomas Mercer did not smile at her the way practical men smile when they think someone is being emotional. He sat down. He put his hands flat on the kitchen table. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "We need to talk about what I found in the basement." 3 days earlier Thomas had pulled away a section of wooden paneling in the basement that had seemed loose. Behind it he found a narrow passage, not a crawl space, not an access panel, but a passage, deliberately constructed, wide enough for a person to move through if they turned sideways, running parallel to the basement wall and ending at a wooden ladder that went straight up. He had assumed it was an old utility access. He had told himself that. He had almost convinced himself. But he had not told Helen because some part of him, the practical part, the part that fixed things and checked foundations, had not wanted to say out loud what another part of him already understood. The ladder went up. He had not climbed it. He told himself he had not climbed it because he did not have a good enough flashlight. The truth was something different. The truth was that when he had stood at the base of that ladder in the dark and aimed his flashlight upward, he had seen, at the very top where the ladder disappeared into the ceiling, a small platform, and on that platform, a blanket folded neatly, and beside the blanket, a tin cup, and beside the tin cup, a collection of small items he could not identify clearly from below except to say that they appeared to be personal. They appeared to have been saved. They appeared, most specifically, to have been collected from various rooms of the house over a considerable period of time. Thomas and Helen Mercer called the police that night. 2 officers came. They searched the passage. They found the ladder. They found the platform. They found the blanket and the tin cup and the collection of items which turned out, when examined closely, to be things taken from each member of the family. A hair ribbon of Claire's. One of Daniel's toy soldiers. A photograph of Helen taken from the frame on her nightstand. A pen from Thomas's desk. Small things. Intimate things. Things chosen deliberately. The officers searched the full extent of the passage system, because it was a system, not a single corridor but a network running through the interior of most of the walls on all 3 floors, connected by ladders and small platforms, with observation points, places where thin gaps had been made in the drywall, barely visible from the rooms themselves but sufficient, more than sufficient, to see clearly into every room in the house. They found evidence that these passages had been used recently. They found evidence that they had been used for a very long time. They did not find a person. Whoever, whatever had been using those walls was gone. For now. The Mercers left that night. They did not pack everything. They did not go back. Thomas carried Daniel and Helen carried Claire, and they walked out to the car and drove to a motel on Route 11 and sat in a room with 2 double beds and every light on, and nobody slept and nobody spoke very much. In the morning they called a lawyer and began the process of breaking their lease. The investigation into the house on Ashford Lane lasted 3 weeks. Police found evidence that the passage system had been in use, intermittently, over a period of decades. The collected items found on the platform spanned years, some of them far predating the Mercer family. A child's button, a woman's locket, a man's wallet, empty of money but containing a photograph. Things taken quietly from families who had lived there and then left and never spoken clearly about why. Nobody was ever found. No arrests were ever made. The case was listed as an open investigation and then quietly filed and then quietly forgotten, the way uncomfortable things in small towns tend to be forgotten. The house was condemned 18 months later on structural grounds. It was demolished in the spring of 1985. The crew that tore it down reported that the wall cavities were far larger than standard construction required. The foreman told a reporter from the local paper that it was the strangest house he had ever worked on, like it had been designed, from the very beginning, to hide something inside itself. Like the walls had been built not to hold the house up but to hold something else in. I found out about the Mercer family 20 years after they left Harlow Creek. I had been researching unexplained cases in rural Virginia for a piece I was writing, and a retired police officer mentioned the house on Ashford Lane the way people mention things they have spent a long time trying not to think about. He gave me a name and a city, and I found Thomas Mercer living in Portland, Oregon, 71 years old, retired, with a vegetable garden and a dog in a very particular habit that his neighbors had noticed over the years. He never closed his interior doors. Not at night, not during the day, not ever. Every door in his house was propped open at all times. His neighbors thought it was an eccentricity. I knew what it was. When I interviewed him he was calm and precise and answered my questions without hesitation, the way people answer questions about things they have accepted completely. I asked him what he thought was most important for people to understand about what happened. He thought about that for a moment. He looked out his window at the street. Then he said this: "The thing that stays with me is not the passages. It is not the platform or the blanket or the objects it collected. Those things are frightening, but they are finite. They have edges. What stays with me is the patience. Whatever was in those walls had been there for years. It had learned that family's rhythms before they even moved in. It had been there for every private moment, every argument, every laugh, every night they tucked their children in and felt safe and turned off the lights and thought they were alone. It watched all of it. It waded through all of it. And it was never in a hurry because it was exactly where it wanted to be." I asked him if he ever felt safe again after leaving. He smiled slightly. He said he felt careful. He said there was a difference. I did not disagree. This has been 80s horror stories. The house on Ashford Lane is gone now. The lot where it stood has been empty for 40 years. Nobody has built on it. In Harlow Creek, if you ask about it, people still hesitate. They still glance toward the road. They still change the subject. Because some knowledge does not leave you when the building comes down. Because the lesson of the house on Ashford Lane is not about one house or one family or one strange man in one dark passage. The lesson is this: you assume that the walls of your home are solid. You assume that the space between what you can see and what exists is empty. You assume that when you are alone, you are alone. Most of the time, you are right. But the walls of the house you are in right now, the house you have lived in for years, the house you know the sounds of and the rhythms of and feel completely safe inside. Have you ever looked closely at them? Have you ever pressed your ear against one and listened? Have you ever noticed a cold spot that moved? A sound that stopped too quickly? A small thing missing that you cannot account for? Probably nothing. Almost certainly nothing. But remember this. The Mercer family lived in that house for 6 weeks before they understood what was happening. 6 weeks of ordinary mornings and ordinary evenings and ordinary nights where they turned off the lights and felt safe. And the whole time, from the very first night, something was already there, already watching, already patient, already home. Some things do not chase you. Some things do not need to. They simply wait. And they are very, very good at it.